There's a recording that was never meant to leave the room where it was made. It was sealed in 1981, buried deep in the archives of a rural Missouri police station, labeled only with a case number and a handwritten note that read, "Do not transcribe, do not release, do not listen alone." For 43 years, that tape sat in a cardboard box beneath decades of dust and bureaucratic silence. The Hazelridge sisters were found on March 14, 1981, walking barefoot along a gravel road outside the town of Crestwood, Missouri. They were 17 and 19 years old. Their clothes were torn, their feet were bleeding. And when the deputy asked them where they'd been, the younger one looked him in the eye and said, "We've been home our whole lives. We just didn't know we were allowed to leave." The older sister didn't speak for 3 days. When she finally did, the officers turned off the tape recorder twice. What she described wasn't just abuse. It was architecture, a family system so carefully constructed, so deeply woven into the fabric of their childhood that even freedom felt like a kind of violence. The Hazelridge case never made national news. There was no trial, no arrests. The parents were never charged. By the time social services arrived at the farmhouse where the girls had lived, it was empty, furniture gone, walls scrubbed, clean. Even the floorboards had been replaced. It was as if the family had been erased from existence, or perhaps as if they had never been meant to exist at all. But the tape remained, and in 2019, a retired detective named Carl Brenneman found it while cleaning out storage before the old station was demolished. He listened to it once. Then he locked it back in the box and didn't sleep for 2 nights. He said the worst part wasn't what the girls described. It was how calmly they described it, like they were reading from a script they'd memorized since birth. This is the story of what the Hazelridge sisters said, and why, even now, some believe it should have stayed buried. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The deputy who found them was named Thomas Gill. He'd been with the Crestwood Police Department for 11 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen anything that stayed with him the way those 2 girls did. He was driving Route 9 just after dawn when he saw them. 2 figures moving slowly along the shoulder of the road, their shapes barely visible through the morning fog. At first, he thought they were hitchhikers. Then he saw their feet. They weren't walking like people trying to get somewhere. They were walking like people who had just learned how. He pulled over, rolled down his window, and the younger one, Margaret, turned to look at him with an expression he would later describe as not quite human. Not in a supernatural sense, but in the way a person looks when they've been kept away from other people for so long that they've forgotten how faces are supposed to move. He asked if they needed help. Margaret nodded. The older sister, Caroline, just stared at the ground. Gil radioed for backup and waited with them on the side of the road. He offered them water. Margaret drank it in small, careful sips, like she was rationing it. Caroline wouldn't touch it. When the second unit arrived, they transported the girls to the station. That's when the questions began. Where do you live? Where are your parents? How long have you been walking? Margaret answered every question with the same eerie precision. She gave their full names, their birth dates, the exact address of the farmhouse they'd come from. But when asked why they left, she said something that made everyone in the room go quiet. She said, "We didn't leave. We escaped. But I don't think we were supposed to be able to." Caroline still hadn't spoken. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at a spot on the wall like she was waiting for permission to exist. The officers contacted the address Margaret had given. No answer. They sent a unit to the farmhouse that afternoon. What they found there would later become the subject of internal debate, interdepartmental confusion, and eventually an unspoken agreement to let the whole thing go. Because what they found wasn't evidence of a crime. It was evidence of something much harder to prosecute. A system, a belief, a way of raising children that had been passed down, refined, and perfected over generations. And the Hazelridge sisters had been its final architects. They had built their own cage. And then, somehow they had found the door. The farmhouse was located 8 miles outside Crestwood, set back from the road by a 1/4 mile of overgrown driveway. It was a 2-story structure, white paint peeling, surrounded by fields that hadn't been worked in years. The officers who arrived that afternoon noted that the property felt wrong before they even got out of the car. Not dangerous, just wrong. Like they were trespassing somewhere they'd been warned not to go. The front door was unlocked inside. The house was immaculate, floors polished, dishes stacked neatly in the cabinets, beds made with hospital corners. But there was no furniture in the living room, no pictures on the walls, no books, no television. Just empty space and the smell of bleach so strong it burned their eyes. In the kitchen, they found a calendar on the wall. Every single day for the past 6 months had been crossed out in red ink. except for March 14th. That day was circled, and written beneath it in careful handwriting were two words: they left. Upstairs, they found the bedrooms. Two of them, small, identical. Each contained a single bed, a wooden chair, and a mirror covered with a white sheet. On the back of each door was a handwritten list. Rules, dozens of them. Some made sense in a twisted, authoritarian way. Others didn't make sense at all. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look at your reflection for longer than 10 seconds. Do not leave your room after the second bell. Do not ask why. At the bottom of each list was a final rule, underlined 3 times. Do not forget that you chose this. The officers photographed the lists, bagged them as evidence. But when they returned to the station and tried to explain what they'd seen, the words felt inadequate. Because the house wasn't a crime scene. It was a teaching tool. And the lesson it taught was obedience so complete, so total, that even the concept of escape had to be unlearned. Back at the station, Margaret had begun to talk. Not in the frantic, emotional way you'd expect from someone who'd just fled captivity, but in the flat, methodical tone of someone giving a report. She explained that she and Caroline had lived in that house their entire lives, that their parents had raised them according to something called the system. She didn't know where the system came from, only that it had been in the family for a long time. Longer than her parents, longer than her grandparents. It was a way of preparing children for a world that, according to her father, was too dangerous and corrupt for them to enter unprepared. So they were kept inside, homeschooled, isolated, taught that the outside world was a test they weren't ready to pass. And every year on their birthday, they were given a choice: stay and continue learning, or leave and face the consequences of their unreadiness. Margaret said they always chose to stay, because leaving didn't feel like freedom. It felt like failure. The psychologist assigned to evaluate the girls was a woman named Dr. Ellen Marsh. She had worked with abuse cases before, children pulled from basements, runaways found living in closets. But she said the Hazelridge sisters were different. They weren't broken in the way trauma usually breaks people. They were functional, polite, articulate. Margaret could recite historical facts, solve complex math problems, and speak with a vocabulary that impressed everyone who interviewed her. Caroline, once she finally started talking, demonstrated similar intelligence. But there was something missing. Dr. Marsh described it as an absence of self. The girls could tell you what they knew, what they'd been taught, what they believed their parents wanted them to believe. But when asked what they wanted, what they felt, who they were beneath the structure, they looked at her like she'd asked them to describe a color that didn't exist. Margaret said it clearest during one of the recorded sessions. She said, "I don't think I'm a person yet. I think I'm still being made." The tapes from those sessions were kept separate from the case file. Dr. Marsh requested they remain confidential, not because of legal concerns, but because she believed the public wasn't ready to hear what the girls described. Not the physical abuse, though there had been some. Not the neglect, though they'd been isolated for years, but the psychological framework that had been used to shape them. The system, as Margaret called it, wasn't random. It was designed. It had stages, phases, milestones. Their father had kept notebooks, hundreds of pages of handwritten instructions, observations, and philosophical justifications for why children needed to be remade before they could be trusted with freedom. He believed that modern society destroyed children by giving them too much autonomy too soon, that the self was a disease that needed to be carefully controlled, pruned, and rebuilt from scratch. And so he had done exactly that. To his own daughters. For 17 and 19 years, Margaret explained that every aspect of their childhood had been intentional. The mirrors covered with sheets, so they wouldn't develop vanity or self-obsession. The meals served at irregular times, so they wouldn't expect comfort or routine. The bells that rang throughout the house, signaling when they could speak, eat, sleep, or move between rooms. She said her father called it liberation through structure. That by removing choice, he was teaching them to make better choices later. That by erasing their personalities, he was giving them the space to build stronger ones. Caroline, in her first full interview, said something that made Dr. Marsh stop the tape and leave the room. She said, "I think he loved us. I think that's what made it so hard to leave. Because if you love someone, you're supposed to trust them. And he trusted the system more than he trusted us. So we trusted it too. Until we didn't anymore." The farmhouse was searched again, this time more thoroughly. In the attic, investigators found the notebooks Margaret had mentioned. 73 of them, spanning 26 years. The earliest entries dated back to before Margaret was born. Her father had been planning this for decades. He'd studied psychology, philosophy, religious texts, prisoner rehabilitation programs, and cult deprogramming methods. He'd taken pieces from all of them and built something new, something he believed was better. The notebooks detailed every stage of his daughter's development, what they were taught, how they responded, what adjustments were made when they showed signs of rebellion or independent thought. There were charts, graphs, timelines. He had tracked their progress like a scientist monitoring an experiment, and in the final notebook dated March 13, 1981, he had written a single sentence: "They have learned enough. It is time to see if the lesson holds." The question everyone kept asking was, where did they go? The parents, the architects of all this carefully orchestrated suffering, because by the time the second search team arrived at the farmhouse, there was no trace of them, no forwarding address, no neighbors who remembered seeing them leave. The property records showed the house had been owned by the Hazelridge family for 3 generations, but there was no mortgage, no utility bills in anyone's name after March 1981. It was as if they had simply evaporated. Margaret said she wasn't surprised. She said her father had always talked about the end of the lesson, that once they were ready, once they had absorbed everything the system was designed to teach them, he and their mother would leave, not as punishment, not as abandonment, but as the final test, to see if his daughters could function in the world without him, to see if the structure he'd built inside their minds was strong enough to stand on its own. But Margaret also said something else, something that didn't make it into any official report, but that Dr. Marsh recorded in her personal notes. She said that on the night before they left, their father sat them down at the kitchen table and told them they had a choice. They could stay in the house, continue living by the system's rules, and wait for him to return. Or they could leave, walk into the world he'd spent 2 decades teaching them to fear, and prove that everything he'd done had been worth it. He told them he would be proud either way, that there was no wrong answer. But Margaret said she saw something in his eyes that night, something that looked almost like hope, like he wanted them to leave, like their escape was the only way he could know if he'd succeeded. Caroline later confirmed this. She said, "I think we were supposed to leave. I think that was the whole point. But I don't know if we left because we wanted to, or because he wanted us to want to. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because this isn't just a story about 2 girls who escaped. It's a story about control so deep it becomes indistinguishable from love, and it forces us to ask a question most people don't want to answer. Can you ever really escape something that was built inside you? Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you discovered your parents, your grandparents, had been part of something like the system, would you run? Would you try to understand? Or would you wonder if maybe, just maybe, some part of you still believed in it? The investigation stalled within weeks. There were no charges to file because there was no one to charge. The girls were legally adults, so they couldn't be placed in foster care. Social services offered them housing assistance, therapy, job placement programs. Margaret accepted. Caroline refused. She said she needed time to think, to figure out who she was without the rules. Marsh continued seeing them both for 6 months, until her funding ran out and the case was quietly closed. In her final report, she wrote something that would later be cited in academic papers about coercive control and psychological captivity. She wrote, "The Hazelridge sisters were not held prisoner by locks or chains. They were held prisoner by belief. And belief, once embedded deeply enough, doesn't need walls. It builds its own." Margaret Hazelridge disappeared from public record in 1987. She had spent 6 years trying to build a normal life. She worked at a library in Springfield, rented a small apartment, attended community college classes in the evenings. People who knew her during that time said she was polite, hardworking, and intensely private. She didn't talk about her past, didn't make close friends, but she seemed to be managing. Then, one morning in October, she didn't show up for work. Her apartment was found empty, rent paid through the end of the month, no note, no forwarding address. Her few belongings were gone. It was as if she had practiced disappearing, as if she had learned it from someone who knew how to vanish without a trace. Some believed she had gone looking for her parents. Others thought she'd simply decided that the world outside the system was too chaotic, too unstructured, and that she needed to return to the only framework that had ever made sense to her. Dr. Marsh believed something else. She believed Margaret had finally become the person her father intended her to be. Autonomous, self-governing, capable of choosing her own structure. And that maybe, in some twisted way, the system had worked exactly as designed. Caroline took a different path. She stayed in Missouri for 2 years, then moved to Colorado, then California, then Oregon. She changed her name twice, worked under the table, avoided anything that required a social security number or a paper trail. In 1993, a journalist tracked her down and requested an interview. She agreed, on the condition that her new name and location wouldn't be published. The interview was never released in full, but fragments of it were included in a book about extreme isolation and family control published in 1996. In it, Caroline said something that still haunts everyone who reads it. She said, "People think we were victims, and maybe we were. But I also think we were experiments that succeeded. My father wanted to prove that you could raise a child without ego, without entitlement, without the noise of modern life. And he did. We existed in a pure form of obedience for nearly 2 decades. The problem is, once you learn to obey that completely, you never stop obeying. You just choose new masters. And sometimes, the new master is the fear that you'll become exactly like him." She also said that she thought about her parents every day. Not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. She wondered where they were, if they'd started over with new children, if the system had been refined, passed down, adapted for a new generation. She said she used to have nightmares that she'd walk into a house somewhere and find 2 little girls sitting in empty rooms, staring at covered mirrors, waiting for bells that would tell them when they were allowed to be human. And in the dream she would realize she was supposed to be the one ringing the bells. That she had inherited the role without ever choosing it. That the system didn't end when she left. It just moved inside her and waited for the right conditions to activate again. She told the journalist she would never have children. Not because she didn't want them, but because she didn't trust herself not to recreate the only model of parenting she'd ever known. The question that haunted investigators, psychologists, and even true crime researchers for years afterward was this: were the Hazelridge sisters abused, or were they educated? Because the line between the two, in their case, was almost invisible. Their father hadn't beaten them, hadn't starved them, hadn't locked them in cages or subjected them to overt cruelty. He had simply structured their entire reality around a philosophy he believed in completely. And that belief, that certainty, was what made the system so effective. Because it wasn't enforced through violence. It was enforced through love, through the unshakable conviction that everything he did was for their benefit. And when your captor believes they're your savior, when they've designed every moment of your life to prove that belief, how do you ever learn to see them clearly? How do you escape something that was built with your best interests in mind? In 2003, a cold case unit in Missouri reopened the Hazelridge file, not because new evidence had surfaced, but because a detective named Laura Penner had heard rumors about similar cases. Families in rural areas, children homeschooled to the point of total isolation, homes with covered mirrors and handwritten rules. She wondered if the system had spread, if it had been documented, shared, passed between families who believed in its philosophy. She requested access to the archived materials, the notebooks, the tapes, the photographs of that sterile, empty farmhouse. What she found made her physically ill, not because of what was in the notebooks, but because of what was written in the margins. Notes in different handwriting, annotations, corrections, suggestions. Her father hadn't invented the system. He had inherited it, refined it, and based on the margin notes he had shared it with others. Penner traced the handwriting, cross-referenced names, found property records for 3 other families in Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa. All of them had owned isolated farmhouses. All of them had homeschooled their children. And all of them had disappeared from public record within a 10-year span between 1978 and 1988. She requested wellness checks on the properties. 2 were abandoned, cleaned out just like the Hazelridge house. The 3rd had been demolished in 1995, replaced by a storage facility. But in the county archives, she found building inspection reports from before the demolition, photographs of the interior, and there in one of the upstairs bedrooms was a list on the back of a door. The same rules, word for word. She submitted a request to track down the children from those families. The request was denied. The case was closed again, this time permanently. The official reason given was lack of resources and insufficient evidence of criminal activity. But Penner believed the real reason was simpler. No one wanted to know how far the system had spread, or how many children had been shaped by it. The tape recording of Margaret Hazelridge's first interview has never been publicly released. But those who have heard it say the most disturbing part comes at the very end. After an hour of calm, methodical answers, the interviewer asks her one final question. If you could go back, would you choose to be born into a different family? There's a long silence. Then Margaret says, I don't know, because I don't know who I would have been without this. Maybe I would have been weaker, more confused. Maybe I would have made worse choices. My father used to say that most people are raised by accident, that parents just react, improvise, hope for the best. But we were raised on purpose. Every single day was designed. And even though it hurt, even though I hated parts of it, I can't say it didn't work. I can think. I can survive. I can function in a world that terrifies me. So maybe the question isn't whether it was right or wrong. Maybe the question is whether I'm grateful. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to answer that. There are people who believe the Hazelridge sisters are still out there, living under new names, maybe together, maybe apart. Some think Margaret found her parents and rejoined them, that she realized the world outside the system was exactly as chaotic and broken as she'd been taught, and she chose to return to the only structure that ever made sense. Others think Caroline is still running, still changing her name, still trying to outrun the version of herself that was built in that farmhouse. But the truth is, no one knows, and maybe that's the real horror of this story. Not what happened to them, but what it means that we'll never know if they escaped. Because freedom, for someone raised inside a system that complete, might not feel like freedom at all. It might just feel like a different kind of cage. One without walls, without rules, without bells to tell you when you're allowed to exist. And for the Hazelridge sisters, that might have been the most terrifying prison of all. The recording is still sealed. The notebooks are still archived, and somewhere in a box in a storage facility in rural Missouri, there's a handwritten note that says, "Do not transcribe, do not release, do not listen alone," because some truths aren't meant to comfort us. Some stories don't have endings that let us sleep at night, and sometimes the most disturbing thing we can learn about the past is that it never really ends. It just finds new places to hide, new children to shape, new families to rebuild in its image. The Hazelridge sisters were found in 1981. But what they said suggests they were never really lost. They were exactly where they were supposed to be, and maybe, in some way we'll never fully understand they still are.